What a cool thing that is, and it's a gift. It really is a gift to have so many young parents here with us and part of our church. Not every church gets to do that, and we're grateful for it. And even the things that we said, I know the hard part about ceremony, any sort of ceremony, is you just kind of say what you're supposed to say and move on. But I challenge you even to put it in your phone over the next few weeks, or to remind yourself, man, some prayers made for these families as they're getting started can be such a powerful thing, and you don't have to know them personally to make it all work out. So I just challenge you to keep up with that. We've been in a series, really since Easter, talking about how Jesus was full of grace, and we've tried to look at grace from several different angles and really focus on how Jesus shows grace, and we're going to do that again here as we conclude the series. The verse we've kind of held on to really all the way through this thing is John chapter 1:14, and it says, "The Word became flesh, Jesus became flesh, and He dwelled among us for a while, and we've seen His glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father." And Jesus is full of grace and full of truth, and 100% grace, 100% truth. And we just have nailed that every week, and you're probably tired of hearing me go into it. But I think it's an important part to remember about Him, the sense that He's 100% about truth, which is to say reality. And this world works a certain way, and Jesus never denies that. One hard pit of truth is that life will be hard. It just will be, and it doesn't matter if you're a really good person or a really bad person or any point in between those two things. It really has very little to do with your goodness and badness sometimes. Sometimes you can be really good, but we live in a broken world, and life can be hard. And Jesus never really tries to hide that. He never really pretends that that's not true. He's always very clear about that, and very clear about the fact that we're one day going to have to stand in front of God. And we don't know when that'll be, but it's coming. And when we have to stand in front of God, the truth is all that's going to matter. And a lot of times the stuff we do wrong, the sin that we do, we have all sorts of excuses and reasons why we did it and why we shouldn't be blamed for it, but it won't matter then because He's 100% about the truth. The guys we had up here in the front, I had somebody tell me when Julie and I did our baby dedication, one old man in the church caught me afterward and said that, you're the reason your kids will be in counseling one day. And that didn't encourage me at all at the moment. But that notion that even the very best and best intentioned parent is just doing the best they can. And sometimes it works out real well, and sometimes it doesn't work out real well. And you wish you could be different, but we're broken. And Paul talks about that, but I feel that in my own life. Even when I try really hard to do the right thing, it's easy to cheat, and it's easy to fall away, and I don't seem like I have the ability to get there on my own, and that's the truth. And Jesus is all about that. He never hides from it. But what we've talked about through this whole series is that He's also 100% grace. And even though we might deserve a whack in the head or some hard words or to lose in a big way, He gives us undeserved grace and a second chance. And the kind of grace, if we're being honest, that's very hard for us to offer to people when they hurt us. It's very hard for us to offer to people when they let us down. But He offers it over and over and over again, even when there's a pretty great risk of recidivism, when there's a pretty great risk that you're going to do it again. The prodigal son story, which we told in the middle of this series, where one of the sons of a man goes off and wastes his life, wastes all the money that his father gave him, that just tarnishes the good name. And then he comes back and he wants to come into the house, and the father lets him. And the older son reminds the father, he'll just do it again, because that's mostly what people do. Maybe you've not had this experience in your life, but the experience of asking God to forgive you for some sin that you're in the middle of. And even as you're praying it, you'll probably do it again. And if you're that smart, then God certainly is smart enough to know that you're probably going to do it again. And yet he shows us grace. It is an amazing thing. It is the kind of thing that you'd want to write songs about. And how he manages that to be 100% grace and 100% truth is a fascination to me, and we've spent the whole series talking about that. In Hebrews, the author of Hebrews kind of reflecting on that idea, says we don't have a high priest who's unable to empathize with our weaknesses, right? But we have one who's been tempted in every way as us, but yet he didn't sin. Jesus is our high priest, and he doesn't stand aloof from our life. He knows what it's like to be a human. He knows what it's like to live life and to be in this broken world, and yet he never fell down. And so we can then, because of that understanding he has, we can approach God's throne of grace with confidence. And we're going to receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. And I hope in some way or fashion that as we went through this series that message has come out loud and clear, that Jesus is someone you can trust to hand your life to, knowing that he's going to see you like you are, probably see you more like you are than you see yourself like you are, and yet there's grace there, and compassion, and mercy. Honestly, a grace and compassion and mercy you might not have received in your own house. You almost certainly did not receive in school or at work. He offers something completely different, and it's completely transformative, and it's unlike any other religion. And when we can learn to be like Jesus and offer that kind of grace, I promise it stands out. People see it and they don't understand it. It's not the way the world works. It's something different. It's something higher. It's something holy and spiritual and out of this world. And when we can learn to follow Christ in those kinds of things, we really can change this place. And so that's kind of been the dream and the hope of the whole sermon. And I've tried to pick out different stories about Jesus that illustrate that show that part of him and how he acts. And today, the story in the series, we're going to talk about, it's in John. I'm going to have a lot of it on the screen. I am going to skip around a little bit today. It's a long chapter, and I'm not going to cover every verse on the screen, but I'll have it on the screen. But it's John 21. It's the very end of Jesus' life, and it's how he reinstates Peter. And if you're not familiar with all that story, or if this is your first time to Mount Pleasant, or if it's your first time in church in a long time, and let me give you a little background so you at least know kind of the main players of what we're talking about. Simon Peter, his name was not given to him by mom and dad as Peter. Jesus calls him that. And he calls him that really on their first meeting. Jesus is teaching on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and Peter has been out the whole night before fishing and didn't catch anything. And he's with his brother Andrew, and they were out all night fishing, and just nothing caught. And we find out later they're business partners kind of with two other brothers, James and John, and the four of them have worked as hard as they can, and it just didn't work. And so the next day they're cleaning their nets. They have them all laid out there on the shore, and they're trying to clean all the brine and everything off the nets so it'll last longer. And Jesus shows up, and he's teaching on the shore, and he's pretty popular. It's hard to imagine today if you went to the beach looking up a preacher while you're there. Hey, let's go find a preacher while we're here on the beach, and probably none of you have ever done that. It's a different world, different kind of environment there, but that's what the people did then. And Jesus was a much better teacher than what you're having to put up with this morning. And people wanted to hear what he had to say, and they're all crowding in there around him. And in fact, there's no microphone, and they're crowding in around him, pushing him a little bit, to the point where his heels are in the water. And so he says to Peter, "Do you mind if I stand in your boat while I teach these guys?" And Peter says, "Sure, that'd be fine." So Jesus stands in his boat, and he teaches the crowd for a little, preaches to them. And when he's done, he tells us, Peter says, "Why don't we go out, try to throw these nets down again and see if we can't catch something?" And Peter says, "We've done this all night, and we haven't caught anything, but because you say so, I'll do it." And I don't know why he does it. It's a crazy, stupid, foolish thing to do. I mean, he knows it won't work. But they go out and they throw the nets in, and the fish just fly into the nets. I mean, they're catching so many fish they can't hardly deal with it, and they're trying to pull them in. The nets are breaking. They call their partners, James and John, over, and they're all trying to work on it together. It's the catch of a lifetime. And Peter turns around and looks at Jesus, and in my head, Jesus is laughing about the whole thing. That's what I would do if I was Jesus. And he says, Peter says to Jesus, "You need to get away from me. I'm a sinful man. In other words, I see what you're doing, and it's cool, but I'm not." There's good people for ministry, and I'm not one of them, Peter says. There's people who you need to help, and I'm not one of those guys. And Jesus kind of tells him two things in that moment. His name wasn't Peter then, like I said. His given name was Simon. And he tells him, Simon, he renames him. He says, you're now Peter, which doesn't mean as much in English, but Peter just means rock. It just means rock in Aramaic and so in Greek. So he says, you're the rock, which would be a lot cooler if you read the story that way. You'd think of Dwayne Johnson maybe. From now on, you're the rock. And they would call him that for the rest of his life. They called him the rock. And in other words, you're going to be like my foundation. You're going to be the guy. And he says to him, the second thing, says, come and follow me, and I'm going to make you a fisher of men. And he does. Peter gives up his whole life and follows Jesus. And he gets closer to Jesus than the other disciples. I mean, there's just no other way to read it than that. He gets to go with Jesus when no other people don't get to go. Jesus invites him to see things other guys don't get to see. Peter walks on water with Jesus. And at the end of their time together, at the Last Supper, when Jesus unloads on them that, you're all going to run out on me tonight, Peter can't believe it. He's the rock. And he tells Jesus, even if all these other jokers walk out on you, jokers aren't going to be found in most English Bibles, but even if all these other jokers walk out on you, I'm not leaving. Even if they all fall away, he says, I won't. And Jesus says, Peter, tonight you're going to deny me 3 times. And he says, yeah, it's not true, Jesus. Even if I have to die for you, I won't leave. And then he does it. And if you're not, again, familiar with the story, there's 3 different times people say, aren't you with Jesus? And 3 different times he says no. And maybe he's just trying to lie a little bit so he can stay close and see what's going to happen to Jesus. But it says the 3rd time when he says, I don't even know the man. And he starts calling down curses on himself, like he's cussing real loud, trying to convince him, I'm not religious, and I don't even know the guy. It says the 3rd time he does it, Jesus can see him in Luke, that Jesus makes eye contact with Peter. And Peter, it hits him what he's done. And it hits him that Jesus heard him do it, and it says he goes out and weeps. He's just broken by it. And so what I want you to think about getting into this thing, I don't know if you've ever had that experience in your life where you just blew it gigantic in front of everybody. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John tell 4 different stories about Jesus, and they all include different things. And it's interesting what all 4 guys think is important enough to put in there, but all 4 guys think it's important to put this story about Peter in there. That here's the rock. I mean, he's the last guy you would think would ever crumble and be scared, and yet at the moment he caved. He caved, and he caved in Jesus' worst moment, and he caved when Jesus needed him the most, and he caved after he bragged about how he'd never leave, and he just broken. I don't know if you've ever had an experience like that where everybody knew, and I'm sure some of you have, because that's how life goes. I was thinking about it in school. When I was in school, we had to stand in the corner still, and we had to, one teacher would draw a circle on the board. We had to put our nose in the circle on the board and stand there in front of the class. Sometimes you have to write sentences. I don't think this generation has to do any of that. I think it's been determined that kind of public shaming will hurt your psyche. But my psyche, if it was hurt, I came through it because I had to do that sort of thing. I remember getting I got paddling, and you'd be taken out in the hall there, and they'd whack you loud enough everybody in the hall in the room could hear it, and then you'd have to walk back in. Didn't hurt, and you try to pretend like it was no big deal, but it was a public kind of shaming. Now, I was after the age, I would see it in comic books where kids had to wear a dunce cap if they were really bad. If any of you are old enough to remember that happening, I did miss out on that era. never had to wear a dunce cap, or never saw anybody have to wear a dunce cap. But public shaming used to be a real popular thing in the schools. It was real effective at getting people back in line. It's tough to look stupid in front of everybody else. But those are all small misdemeanors. What Peter did was gigantic. And you wonder how he'll get back through it. And so that's what this chapter opens up with. It says, afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples up by the Sea of Galilee, and it happened this way. It says, I'm going to go fish, Peter tells them. I'm going to go fish. And they said, we'll go with you. And so there's about 7 of the disciples. They aren't all up there. And Peter and 7 of the disciples went up, and they fished all night long, but they didn't catch anything. And people read this a couple different ways. Some people read it like, well, Jesus is gone. You know, got to do something else with your life now, I guess. And but see, the first verse I read, this is the 3rd time. So they know that Jesus is back. When he came back, he didn't spend all of his time with the disciples. It's a little different relationship. And maybe Peter thinks, well, I mean, I remember how it all started, right? On Peter's boat. Get away from me, Jesus. I'm not the right kind of guy. And now he's blowing it real big, and I think he's just going to go back and fish. And maybe feels like it was a neat couple of years, and I learned a lot, but I knew that I wasn't that kind of guy. And so I'm going to go back to what I know. And he fishes all night. Now, fishing for them they could use a hook, and there's a story in the Bible where Peter does fish with a hook, but for the most part, they would use nets, and they would use these trammel nets, and there'd be 2 boats, and they would run a net between the 2 of them, and half of the net is on the top, and then it would come down like a wall, and it would catch the fish. They would try to position their boats where a school of fish would come into that and kind of be trapped. It was 3 sides there, led down between the boats, and then in front of the boats there, between the 2 boats, and the fish would kind of get caught in there, and then they would toss another net on top of them, and that's how they'd catch them. And a lot of times the guys would have to swim in there and fish them out if it was a real big load. Sometimes they could pull the nets in if it wasn't too big. And they would do that all night, one after another. So you'd throw the nets in and you'd swim around, try to catch the schools. And it's you usually get something, you know, just because it's such a big net and you usually don't get something. But they fished all night and they didn't catch a thing, which is a little unusual. It'd be one of those nights, but they don't have too many of these nights, and it'd be very disappointing. And early in the morning, it says Jesus was standing on the shore, but the disciples couldn't see that it was Jesus. Maybe he's too far away, or it's a little foggy or whatever. And he calls out to them, friends, you got any fish? Which is kind of rubbing salt in the wound, and no, they answer. He says, well, why don't you throw your nets on the other side of the boat? I bet you get some. And they did it. Which again, remember how it works. Right? There's 2 boats and the net's between the 2 boats, and you toss the net in between the 2 boats. That's where the fish are caught. To just toss it on the other side, well, I mean, you don't get anything. And Jesus says, won't you just toss it on the other side and see if you get anything? And they do it because they've had an episode like this before. You know, they don't see it's Jesus yet, but there was another time when they first met Jesus where he tells them, just toss them in there, see what happens. And they caught a bunch. And these guys have changed in the last couple years. And so, okay, let's see what happens. And they toss them on the other side. And it says that they couldn't even bring the net in. There was such a large number of fish. And then the disciple whom Jesus loved, he says to Peter, well, it's Jesus, it's the Lord. And Peter, as soon as he heard him say that, he wraps himself up. You know, he'd kind of probably taken off his outer deal. He'd been one of the ones swimming in there, wraps himself up because it's disrespectful to go up naked to Jesus, wraps himself up and jumps in the water and swims up to Jesus just to hang out with him. And the other disciples are working, and they're doing the best they can to get the fish in there, and the whole net's full of fish, and they're dragging it in. It'll mention, and one of the verses I skipped, that Peter will go out at the end and drag the net in, which is kind of a subtle little thing to say, but it mentions 153 large fish. So when Peter, it just says he does it, when he drags it in, it's about a 400 or 500 pound dead drag over the sand. And Peter was a really big dude. which kind of makes all the betrayal and cowardice and stuff, if you can imagine somebody like that you know, who's just a really big guy, you know, kind of used to throwing his weight around. He's used to being the one who wins the game if it's an athletic thing. He's just, you know, big guys carry themselves a certain way, and in his he had this weak moment. I don't know, it probably contributed to how awful it felt. Well, anyway, they're coming in with the fish, and when they landed, there's already a fire of burning coals there with some fish on it and bread. And Jesus said, let's have breakfast. It's not spiritual at all. It's just, hey, let's just hang out for a little bit. And I wonder if it's on purpose because of Peter and him feeling like, you know, I don't know. It's just real subtle. Ron Swanson, I think, said that there's no injury that can't be healed with breakfast food, and that's true. A little eggs and bacon, 100% back on the deal again. And when they finished eating, Jesus, this is the part that's the most important. He starts talking to Simon Peter, and he says, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And I highlighted a couple of things I want to point out. Remember, Jesus never called him his name. If Jesus ever talked to him, "Hey, Rock, you know, what are we going to do about this?" Or, "Hey, Rock, what do you think?" "Hey, Rock," you know, Rocky or something. He always called, "Hey, Rock, what do you think we ought to think about this?" And because it meant how I see this strength in you, Peter. I see this, you know, this foundation. And when Jesus doesn't do that, I wonder if that stung a little bit. I wonder if it dug a little bit at him. It might have. You know, and Jesus is 100% about the truth. He doesn't run away from it. I mean, Peter had a bad moment. So he says, "Simon, son of John," like, I'm not going to force this name on you if you don't want it. "Simon, son of John," he says, "do you love me more than these?" And I don't know what that means exactly. People debate about that. It could be talking about the fish and the boats. "Do you love me more than this?" You know, are you really wanting to go back to fish? And that might be what he's saying. But I wonder if he's not bringing up that thing that Peter said at the Last Supper. Even if all these jokers fall away, I won't. Do you really love me more than these guys? Do you love me more than they do? And Peter says, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." And Jesus says, "Feed my lambs." And then he asks him a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And he says, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you. Well, take care of my sheep." And then a third time. I remember Peter had denied Jesus 3 times. And so Jesus is asking him 3 times. This is kind of how he brings him back. He says, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Now, there's a subtle thing going on in Greek, and I'm not sure it's even important. People debate about whether it's important. But John uses different words when he says the love stuff. There's 2 different words. There's a word agape, which means like a soldier has agape if he lays his life down for his country. Romeo and Juliet would have had that kind of love. You know, I would give everything for you, kind of. It's like every part of me is yours. That's agape. That's the highest love you can have. And then there's phileo, like we get Philadelphia, brotherly love. Phileo just means we're buddies. You know, we're friends, we're buddies. And Jesus says to him the first time, "Do you agape me?" Or like, are you willing to give it all? And Peter says, "You know we're buddies. You know we're phileo." He doesn't answer with the same word. And Jesus asks the second time, "Do you agape, or will you give it all?" And Peter says, "You know we're buddies." He won't do that higher word. And then the third time, Jesus changes the word. And he says, "Simon, son of John, are we really buddies? I mean, are you sure?" And it hurt Peter that Jesus asked him the third time. And Peter says back to him, "You know everything. You're my friend. I mean, And Jesus says, "Well, feed my sheep." And then he said, "Follow me." He's right back to the beginning. Then let's move on. You know, if we're friends, then let's move on. Let's put it behind us. Let's go on to the next chapter, whatever the next chapter is. Peter's not bold anymore. He's not willing to say that I'll do anything. Peter's not willing to jump all the way out and commit himself. He's not even sure if he can. Really, he's right back to where he started. Lord, you might want to look for somebody else. And in that condition, Jesus can use him. You know, there's a weird thing about the faith. When you get too cocky about it and you start thinking you've got it all figured out, you're not really usable exactly. I had somebody tell me when I was a kid, we would ride dirt bikes around, and I was being stupid with them, and this older fellow says, you know, when you quit being a little scared of this, that's when it's going to bite you. And it didn't make any sense to me at all, because I was pretty cocky about what I was doing. But he was right. Once you get like that, it's just a matter of time for you to do something stupid. And there's something about that with faith too. When you lose the awe of God, when you forget that you're just a sinner like the rest of us, when you start thinking of like, even if these other jokers do it, I won't. Once you start crossing that line, you become a lot less usable to God. And he's not chewing his nails hoping you get it right every time. He just wants you to follow him. You know, we're not saved by our strength. And this whole story, if we can talk about what it illustrates, it shows Jesus 100% truth. He reminds Peter of the big mistake. He doesn't run from it. You really made a big mistake, and it probably hurt Jesus. He doesn't ever tell him that it hurt, but it probably did. And he doesn't run away from that. And if Peter wants to quit, Jesus will let him. If he doesn't want to do it anymore, he'll let him. But he tries to bring him back, and that's grace. And he lets Peter know that the invitation is still open, and that's grace. And Peter's basically admitting to Jesus, I don't know if you want me anymore. I'm broken. And Jesus says, perfect. You know, you're right back where I can use you again. I remember through the years, a lot of people have told me that when we're praying about some awful thing, that they really let God down, especially like at church camp. High schoolers it might feel like they made a decision to follow, and then they really let God down. But you were never supporting God. God knew what he was getting into when he extended the invitation. You know, there's a thing, and I'm going to explain it badly, but in psychology, a codependent thing. A person's dependent, maybe a husband or a wife is dependent on alcohol, and then the person who lives with them, you know, their spouse, their husband or their wife, well, because the guy, say he's drunk, well, the wife learns to be something too. Maybe she becomes a martyr for the whole family, and everything it has to be about her. Everybody telling her how awesome she is, or she's good at guilt, and or maybe she learns how to be mean, or maybe she learns how to be distant, or maybe she learns how to find her own ways to cope, and they're not healthy. But she's codependent on him. Like, he's dependent on the alcohol, but she's codependent on him being bad so she can defend her own bad. The prodigal son's kind of a story like that. The older brother sees the younger brother be such a mess. Well, that allows the older brother to be arrogant, allows him to be cocky, allows him to be proud. He needs the younger brother to mess up so he can be so okay. And we all do that. We all do that. I mean, even at this point, if Julia's a little distant to me one morning, then it's easy for me to be distant to her, or to be mean, or to be hateful, or whatever. She can, and it may be something she didn't even know where she's doing. And I'm sure it's the other way too, that I could do something, and my little bit of arrogance, or my little bit of meanness, or my little bit of cruelty makes her want to do something back. And we allow the other person's sin to give us an excuse. Well, Jesus is never codependent. He's never depending on you for anything, because he never changes. He's 100% truth, and he sees you exactly like you are, but he's 100% grace, and the door is always open. Any one of you can come back at any time. And that's not just for the prodigal sons. That's not just for the ones who have ran out and been stupid, but that's also for the older sons who think that they're so good they don't need to repent, who think that they're so good they may not need grace anymore, who think that they're so good that God owes them a lot of things. And whenever anything goes wrong, they pray, God, what's happening? I've slaved for you for years. This is how you're going to treat me? And he's there for both of them. He's there for you. One thing I want you to catch out of this whole sermon series is even though our lives can be challenging, and even though this world can be hard, Jesus never changes. And he's there for you, and you can't let him down. And I want you to know, any one of you, that if you need to come to Christ today, that door is open. And there will be people in the front, and we'll pray with you. There'll be somebody standing by the back door, and if you want to go that way, and we'll pray with you, and we'll help you make whatever decision you need to make to get yourself right with God. But I challenge you to take today to get right with God. Won't you stand up and let's pray together. Dear Lord God, I thank you for this group. God, we come in from all sorts of different places and all sorts of different reasons. And God, in this moment, at this time, we all have different things we need to cry out to you. So I just pray right now for the ones who are here that they be brave enough, God, to speak to you, to call out to you, to ask you, God, to move in their lives. And I pray, God, that you do move that way, like you say you will. In Jesus' name, amen.